What up everyone, I am Gallon Havoc and I'm back with another episode of Inspired By. So I've been talking about this quite a lot lately, but I've neglected to do it because, quarantine life drains the shit out of me. But now, I'm breaking the limits. So without further ado, let's get started. Today we are covering famed comic book artist Frank Miller, whose style you may recognize from comics like Sin City, The Dark Knight Returns, and also one of my favorite Marvel superheroes, Daredevil. Now, Frank Miller is easily one of the most influential artists of the modern comic book world. In the last episode where I talked about James O'Barr, I mentioned how O'Barr used minimal color and one source of lighting. Frank Miller pretty much pioneered that. He also brought the isolated color feel that I love so much into the fold as well, and the tone of many of his work was what you would see in old film noir movies, complete with dramatic, charismatic monologues from his characters.
Well, I'm gonna find that son of a bitch that killed you, and I'm gonna give him the hard goodbye.
So now, let's go into the history of Frank Miller. Miller grew up a comic book fan. In the 70s, he sent a letter into Marvel, which would be published in The Cat No. 3. Later, his first published work gained the attention of Neil Adams, who was known for his work on DC's Batman and Green Arrow, who took Miller under his wing and gave him critiques and occasional lessons to further Miller's potential. Eventually, Miller would move on to Marvel, where he penciled an issue of John Carter, Warrior of Mars, in 1978. While still with Marvel, he would settle in as a regular fill-in as well as cover artist for various titles, one being Peter Parker, The Spectacular Spider-Man, numbers 27 and 28, which guest starred Daredevil. Around this time, the Daredevil comics themselves were suffering due to low popularity, but Miller saw potential in the blind superhero and went on to work on the main line of Daredevil comics. Miller's work on The Blind Lawyer from Hell's Kitchen began as a writer. However, that alone was not enough to boost Daredevil's failing popularity. So Miller took it into his own hands as both writer and penciler as of issue 168 in 1980, where he debuted the famous femme fatale, Elektra. Since Miller taking over, Daredevil's popularity began its steady climb back up at the ranks. Miller added several elements to Daredevil's martial arts background, including characters like Stick, a martial arts master who would teach both Daredevil and Elektra, and the evil ninja mercenaries, the Hand, thoroughly adding to Daredevil's lore. However, Miller couldn't handle both writing and penciling on a monthly schedule, so he began relying on Klaus Johnson, who had inked the Daredevil comics up to that point, for the artwork side of things, with Miller only providing rough sketches of what he wanted. Miller's work on Daredevil became synonymous with darker themes. He was responsible for the iconic story of famous assassin Bullseye killing Elektra, which was faithfully recreated in the movie, I might add. And Daredevil in turn trying to kill him. By the end of Miller's run with Daredevil, the Devil of Hell's Kitchen had rose from a second-tier character to one of Marvel's most popular. He also began drawing for DC in a short Batman Christmas story called Wanted Santa Claus Dead or Alive in spring 1980. This would be Miller's second character to become closely associated with, first being Daredevil. He also did work as a penciler and co-plotter on the X-Men in the form of the Wolverine miniseries in 1982, with writer Chris Claremont, expanding Wolverine's character. Then came Miller's very own comic in the form of DC's 6-issue miniseries, Ronin. This would be his first creator-owned project. After some unpublished works, Miller then released one of his most popular creations, Batman: The Dark Knight Returns, as writer and penciler in 1986. This would also mark the beginning of Batman's nickname, The Dark Knight. The Dark Knight Returns introduced a new form of adult-oriented storytelling to mainstream audiences in the comic world, alongside Alan Moore's Watchmen, which came out around the same time. And 25 years later, The Dark Knight Returns remains one of the best-selling comic book stories of all time. Shortly after, Miller returned to Daredevil in the role of writer, and released a self-contained story called Badlands, and then later, Daredevil Born Again. Born Again traveled into Daredevil's own Catholic background, once again reinventing and reinvigorating the characters, as well as going in-depth with Daredevil's nemesis, Wilson Fisk, aka the Kingpin. Miller would also work on Daredevil Love and War, indirectly bridging Miller's own first run with the character and the arc of Born Again, as well as releasing a miniseries starring Elektra called Elektra Assassin. His last work of the 80s consisted of mainly Batman in the form of Batman Year One, a retelling of the Batman's origins in the same vein of his work in Dark Knight Returns. This story would retcon much of the original lore in favor of Miller's style, and remains to this day one of his most popular works, and one of the most popular takes on the character. Come the 1990s, Miller released one last project with Elektra Lives Again, which showed the titular assassin's resurrection from the dead. After this, he set out to release his own independent work with Dark Horse Comics. After working on smaller projects such as Hard Boiled, Give Me Liberty, and writing the scripts of RoboCop 2 and 3, as well as the crossover miniseries RoboCop vs. Terminator come 1991, Miller would come to work on his most notable creation, and my favorite, Sin City. Sin City was another great success, taking place in a film noir-style world entirely of Miller's own creation. It was first serialized through Dark Horse Presents issues 51 through 62, and with its success, it was eventually released as a paperback called The Hard Goodbye, starring the popular badass Marv. From there, he returned to Marvel to once again work on Daredevil in the miniseries called The Man Without Fear. This also led him to write both issue 11 of Image Comics' Spawn and the crossover of Spawn and Batman. In 1998, Miller would release 300 as its writer and penciler, retelling the historic story of the 300 Spartans who went up against the entirety of the Persian Empire. Come the 2000s, Miller took somewhat of a lesser role than the 80s or 90s, having worked on several more Batman-based projects, including Superman and Batman World's Funniest, Batman The Dark Knight Strikes Again, a sequel to the Dark Knight Returns story, though nowhere near as popular, and All-Star Batman and Robin The Boy Wonder. He did help to write and direct the film adaptation of Sin City with director Robert Rodriguez, which received much praise for its faithfulness to the source material. I'm going to have to do a Sin City review at some point. And at first, Miller was actually very hesitant to release a movie of his beloved work until Rodriguez showed him the adaptation of the short story The Customer Is Always Right, which convinced Miller that Rodriguez was onto something. They then went on to release the sequel tie-in film Sin City: A Dame to Kill For in 2014, which, while not nearly as successful as its predecessor, it was still quite popular. He also helped to produce the 2007 adaptation of 300 directed by Zack Snyder, which also became quite popular for obvious reasons.
This is Sparta!
Afterwards, Miller returned to comics with another sequel to his Dark Knight Returns story known as The Dark Knight 3: The Master Race, though this time it was co-written by Miller. It was a success, becoming the top-selling comic of November 2015. Miller would then be inducted into the Eisner Awards Hall of Fame. Since 2017, Miller has been working on several fledgling projects, such as a King Arthur adaptation known as Cursed, which has been slated for a Netflix 10-episode release, a Superman Year One story similar to Batman's own Year One arc, and another story set in the 300 universe from the point of view of the Persian Emperor Xerxes, which will be Miller's first full return to writing since Holy Terror. And that pretty much covers the history of Frank Miller. Talk about a seasoned veteran of the comic business. Still with that long, decorated career, let's talk about his technique. As a writer, Miller was not afraid to delve into darker stories of many characters, like Daredevil and Batman. He expanded on themes such as religion, revenge, romance, and crime, and his storytelling was very much inspired by the film noir movies of old. Think Casablanca but darker. By this, I mean his characters were known for self-contained monologues, especially in Sin City.
Most people think Marv is crazy. He just had the rotten luck of being born in the wrong century. He'd be right at home on some ancient battlefield swinging an axe into somebody's face.
The film noir style became his most identifiable staple, and the way they adapted this into the Sin City film was just perfection. He also had a deep understanding of the darker side of city life, especially shown through his work on Daredevil, showcasing a darker, grittier New York with its criminal underworld themes. And the artwork was in heavy contrast to Spider-Man's New York, which was more bright and colorful and inviting, while Daredevil's was dark and foreboding. The way he drew environments was reminiscent of German Expressionism, using dramatic edges and shadows in the skyline. Miller also took great inspiration from Japanese style art, which can be seen in his work on Ronin, combining elements of standard American comics with Japan's manga style. Regarding his comic style, he has come out and said that rather than America's more wordy comics and Japan's more empty and open, he attempted to do a hybrid of the two. As for his characters, Miller showcased a rougher, less clean-cut style than the standard comic book character, using a lot of shadows and sketch lines to get the hard life feeling across. The way he drew characters also bordered on realistic and cartoony, which just added on to his overall charm. Also in Sin City, he also used another form of isolated color, my favorite form of coloring, and would only show certain things in color to make those things really pop. And the way they adapted this into the films was, perfection. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's talk about how Frank Miller inspired me. Similar to James O'Barr, Frank Miller uses a largely black and white style using minimal light sources, which I love, because shadows really accentuate the mood, especially the more darker ones. Edgy. I've always loved the more darker things. Miller's more film noir mobster aesthetics were especially appealing to me. Trench coats, fedoras, all that fun stuff. Even his stories, delving into themes of revenge, romance, crime, justice, retribution, all seamlessly, are all inspiring. Characters like Daredevil, Batman, John Hartigan, Dwight McCarthy, Nancy Callahan, even Marv, all have felt fleshed out under Miller's writing, and the way he drew them respectively was unique as well. Daredevil, the devil of Hell's Kitchen, the grizzled Dark Knight, Batman, the down-on-his-luck cop, Hartigan, the dysfunctional private investigator, Dwight, the tough damsel in distress, Nancy, and the burly, take-no-shit, doesn't-give-a-fuck tough guy, Marv. Speaking of which, here's my version of Marv, as per tradition. I do want to experiment with a more black and white style some more, so this is a bit of progress. Anyway guys, that pretty much wraps it up for this episode. Next time we'll be returning to comics with the legendary Mark Silvestri, who is known for his work in Witchblade, The Darkness, Cyberforce, X-Men, Wolverine, and Batman. So in the meantime, I'm Gallant Havoc, and I'll see you in the next one.